It began with a sentence that sounded almost casual, a reference to ships moving east, a remark about readiness, nothing theatrical, no raised voice. Just the quiet acknowledgement that additional naval assets were already en route to a region that has learned to measure silence more carefully than noise. When movements of that scale are described as routine, it usually means the decision was made earlier, somewhere behind closed doors, long before the public language caught up with it. In the span of a few hours, two things happened that, taken separately, might have been dismissed as background friction. A reconnaissance drone approached an American carrier group operating in international waters near Iran's coastline. Not erratically, not by accident. It continued forward despite warnings designed specifically to avoid escalation. And later that same day, armed boats maneuvered toward a U.S.-flagged tanker in the narrow corridor of the Strait of Hormuz, issuing radio messages that were less ambiguous than diplomatic phrasing prefers. Two pressure points activated within the same 12-hour window. No formal declaration, no open hostilities, just proximity, deliberate proximity. At first glance, the drone's destruction resolved the immediate issue. An F-35 launched, a missile fired, debris fell into the sea. Clean, procedural. But what tends to be overlooked in moments like that is not the interception itself. It is what occurred in the minutes before. The drone transmitted imagery back to shore. That means the carrier's configuration, its escort pattern, its radar posture, and its flight deck activity were observed and recorded. A reconnaissance platform sacrificed at minimal cost in exchange for data about the most complex floating military system ever built. It seems insignificant until you connect the sequence. Because a carrier strike group is not just a ship, it is a moving network of sensors, interceptors, electronic warfare systems, and layered defenses. It functions on predictive logic. Algorithms calculate trajectories. Interceptors are fired toward anticipated coordinates. Radar arrays sweep for patterns. The architecture assumes that incoming threats behave within certain parameters. And this is where the main thing begins. When a threat no longer follows a predictable arc, the mathematics that underpins defense begins to strain. In recent years, Iran has invested less in traditional naval parity and more in asymmetry. Ballistic missiles modified for anti-ship roles. Cruise missiles launched from concealed coastal batteries. Hypersonic glide vehicles designed not simply to travel fast, but to alter course mid-flight. At speeds exceeding Mach 10, even minor deviations render predictive models unstable. Add the plasma envelope generated by hypersonic velocity, an effect that can distort radar returns, and reaction time compresses from minutes to seconds. That compression is not dramatic, it is mechanical, and mechanical constraints are rarely forgiving. But no single missile defines the doctrine. The concept that concerns planners is saturation, multiple launch vectors, mixed altitudes, drones to occupy tracking systems, subsonic cruise missiles to drain interceptors, ballistic arcs to force high-altitude engagements, hypersonic vehicles arriving through the gaps created by the first waves. Not because one weapon guarantees success, but because systems have finite capacity. Fire control computers process only so many targets simultaneously. Interceptor magazines are not infinite. Electronic warfare systems degrade under persistent load. At some point, even advanced defenses begin to prioritize rather than neutralize. The drone that approached the carrier did not need to survive. Its value was in observation, real-time positioning, radar orientation, deck operations, wind conditions, all variables that determine vulnerability windows. It is rarely discussed openly how critical those windows are. Carriers are most exposed during flight operations, when aircraft are armed, fueled, and maneuvering on deck. A surveillance platform loitering just long enough to capture that rhythm does not need explosives to alter the strategic equation. And the maritime pressure in the Strait of Hormuz the same day was not an isolated act either. It forced American assets to respond in two directions simultaneously. One carrier group adjusting posture offshore, one destroyer shifting to escort a commercial vessel through constricted waters. Response capacity divided, attention divided. It appears minor until you consider the cumulative strain of parallel contingencies. Meanwhile, diplomatic language grows narrower. References to options on the table surface more frequently. Negotiations remain technically alive, yet the buffer between incident and retaliation appears thinner. When senior officials weigh terminating talks over a drone encounter, it signals proximity to a threshold that once seemed distant. There is no public announcement of that threshold, but its outline becomes visible in reaction patterns. Behind the visible exchanges lies another layer that receives less attention. Shipments of solid propellant components arriving at Iranian ports, despite sanctions regimes designed to prevent exactly that. Ballistic missile tests conducted across multiple provinces within short intervals. Reports indicating rapid replenishment of missile inventories following previous conflicts. Industrial tempo rather than rhetorical posturing. It suggests manufacturing resilience, and resilience changes timelines. The regional architecture compounds the picture. Militias positioned in neighboring states, armed groups capable of launching rockets and drones toward U.S. installations from multiple directions. Non-state actors integrated into a broader deterrence framework. In a confrontation scenario, pressure would not concentrate on a single axis. It would fragment across several. The purpose would not necessarily be decisive victory, but systemic overload. Western analysts do not agree on outcomes. Some argue layered defenses remain sufficient. Others note that even a low probability of penetration carries disproportionate consequences when applied to a carrier deck crowded with aircraft and munitions. A single high-mass warhead at hypersonic velocity does not merely damage steel. It triggers cascading events, secondary detonations, flight deck fires, magazine risks. No planner assumes invulnerability. They calculate risk margins. Those margins narrow as technology evolves. None of this guarantees escalation. It does not confirm inevitability. It simply outlines a structure in which miscalculation carries amplified cost. A reconnaissance drone approaches closer than expected. A missile battery misreads a radar signature. A commander interprets a maneuver as preparatory rather than observational. In tightly compressed timelines, decisions occur faster than clarification. What remains unspoken is whether the current pattern represents deterrence working as designed or deterrence approaching its limit. When reconnaissance platforms are sacrificed without hesitation and naval groups reposition without announcement, it suggests both sides are testing boundaries. Not loudly, not theatrically, quietly, procedurally. And at this point, the system usually shows its limits not through declarations, but through strain, a moment when simultaneous pressures exceed intended thresholds. We are not there yet, but the geometry of forces in the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz is becoming denser, more reactive, more compressed. The movements continue, the language remains measured, the calculations grow tighter, and the space between incident and consequence is no longer as wide as it once was. The strain becomes visible when you stop looking at individual incidents and begin mapping the architecture behind them. The reconnaissance flight was not an isolated provocation. It was a node in a targeting chain. Surveillance platforms gather positional data. Coastal radar stations refine it. Command centers fuse it with satellite feeds and signals intelligence. What appears as a single drone approaching a carrier is, in operational terms, a sensor extending the horizon of land-based strike systems. The platform itself is expendable. The data it transmits is not. A carrier strike group relies on layered defense built around anticipation. Long-range detection feeds into interceptor launch calculations. Electronic warfare systems attempt to disrupt guidance before kinetic engagement becomes necessary. But these layers assume sequence. Threat detected, trajectory assessed, countermeasure deployed. Saturation doctrine is designed to collapse that sequence. When dozens of objects enter tracking range at staggered altitudes and velocities, fire control logic begins to prioritize. Prioritization is the first concession in any defensive system. It acknowledges that not everything can be intercepted simultaneously. Hypersonic glide vehicles complicate this further, not because they are unstoppable, but because they are less predictable. Traditional ballistic missiles follow arcs constrained by gravity and boost phase physics. Glide vehicles detach and maneuver within the upper atmosphere. Even slight course corrections force recalculation loops inside Aegis algorithms. Reaction windows shrink. Electronic warfare attempts to jam guidance systems, but plasma effects generated by extreme velocity distort sensor returns for both sides. The engagement becomes a race between computation and arrival time. Seconds matter. Magazine depth matters more. Magazine depth is rarely discussed publicly. Each interceptor carried by escort destroyers represents finite inventory. In a saturation scenario, drones and subsonic cruise missiles serve a purpose beyond direct lethality. They consume interceptors. They demand radar attention. They stretch electronic warfare bandwidth. By the time higher velocity penetrators arrive, defensive layers may already be degraded. Not collapsed, but thinned. Defense does not fail catastrophically at first. It erodes incrementally. Execution of such a doctrine requires precision timing. Strike planners need carrier orientation, escort spacing, radar coverage bias, and deck cycle rhythm. The earlier reconnaissance flight contributed to that data set. The attempted tanker interference in the Strait of Hormuz on the same day contributed something else: response mapping, how quickly assets shift, which vessels detach to escort commercial shipping, how air cover is allocated. In effect, a live rehearsal of distributed stress. The regional dimension expands the problem set. Iran's ballistic missile forces are not the sole vector. Militia networks in Iraq possess drones and rockets capable of targeting U.S. bases. Yemeni forces have demonstrated anti-ship missile employment against moving vessels. Lebanese formations retain rocket arsenals. In a coordinated escalation, pressure would not be centralized. It would fragment across geography. American air defense units in multiple countries would engage simultaneously. Carrier aviation would be tasked not only with protecting the fleet, but with suppressing launch sites across dispersed terrain. The operational tempo would accelerate beyond peacetime assumptions. Industrial indicators suggest preparation rather than improvisation. Solid propellant shipments enable sustained production cycles. Rapid replenishment of missile inventories after previous conflicts indicates manufacturing resilience. Missile testing across multiple provinces demonstrates distributed basing. Underground storage complexes reduce vulnerability to preemptive strikes. The deterrent model shifts from symbolic capability to scalable inventory. From Washington's perspective, strike options exist. Carrier-based aviation, long-range bombers, and precision munitions can target command infrastructure and missile batteries. But preemption carries uncertainty. Mobile launchers relocate. Coastal batteries are concealed. Urban density complicates targeting calculus. A limited strike intended to degrade capability may instead trigger full regional activation. Decision makers must weigh not only the probability of success, but the cascade that follows initial action. The critical variable is not raw destructive power. It is compression. Compression of time between detection and impact. Compression of geography as multiple theaters activate concurrently. Compression of diplomatic margin as each incident reduces tolerance for ambiguity. When negotiation channels narrow, military signaling occupies the space. Signaling, in turn, increases the risk of misinterpretation. Carrier groups remain formidable. Layered defenses, electronic warfare, and integrated air cover provide significant protection. Yet no defense is designed for infinity. The question is not whether a single missile can sink a carrier. It is whether a coordinated strike package can create a window in which probability shifts. Even a small shift becomes strategically consequential when applied to assets of that magnitude. If escalation occurs, the opening phase would likely resemble chaos rather than clarity. Missile launches from coastal batteries, drone swarms rising from concealed sites, rockets targeting fixed installations, electronic interference across regional airspace, interceptors leaving launch rails in rapid succession, command centers triaging incoming tracks. Within minutes, the operational picture would fragment into parallel engagements. Beyond the immediate exchange lies structural impact. Energy markets respond to instability in the Strait of Hormuz with volatility. Insurance rates for commercial shipping spike. Allied governments reassess force posture. Adversaries observe performance under live conditions. Deterrence credibility is recalibrated in real time. There is no inevitability written into this sequence. The same architecture that enables saturation also functions as deterrence, signaling cost to any initiator. Yet deterrence operates on perception of thresholds. When reconnaissance flights approach closer, when naval advisories instruct commercial vessels to alter transit routes, When missile inventories expand quietly beneath the surface, it suggests both sides are calibrating for scenarios they prefer not to execute. What makes the situation structurally alarming is not open war, but cumulative normalization. Each incident absorbed without escalation becomes precedent. Each boundary tested without consequence invites further testing. Over time, the margin for error contracts. The system continues functioning. Ships patrol, drones launch, negotiations resume and pause. But beneath that continuity lies a dense network of triggers and counter-triggers.